All right. So, hello, everyone. Greetings from UC Irvine. I hope everybody is safe and well wherever you're situated. My name is Chris Fan. I'm an assistant professor in the English department here at UCI, as well as in the departments of Asian American Studies and East Asian Studies. I'm one of the co-PIs of the University of California Speculative Futures Collective, and I'll be the host and moderator of this virtual symposium that we're going to be kicking off today, Transnational Equivalences and Inequalities. Today's panel is titled Carceral Bodies, and we have 4 wonderful presentations ahead of us today. But before we begin, I'd like to take just a few minutes to introduce the collective and the symposium, and this will also give folks a few more minutes to log in. So the UC Speculative Futures Collective was established through a UC multi-campus research programs and initiatives grant at the end of 2018. Building on the premise that in order to create a better world, we first have to imagine it. The mission of the collective is to make space and provide funding for projects that develop speculative cultural forms and theories that might help to address issues of ecology, gender, sexuality, race, and inequality, among others. Our symposia brought together faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates, as well as artists, activists, and community members. The first symposium was convened at UCSD last November by Shelley Strebe, the PI on the grant and our fearless leader. The theme there was climate change and ecologies. Nalo Hopkinson convened the second symposium last December at UC Riverside under the heading of the Futures of Education. And this past March, Neda Atanasowski hosted Santa Cruz's symposium, The Speculative Futures of Labor, New Feminist and Critical Race Approaches. Next year, UCSD will be hosting a multi-day conference that will reconvene presenters and grant recipients from all of our symposia, as well as include new programming. But rather than a culmination, that event, we hope, will be the beginning of many more projects and programs to come. So stay tuned for more information about all of that. The team is working very hard behind the scenes to nail down details, and we'll share all that with you very, very soon. So the multi-week virtual symposium that we're kicking off today, Transnational Equivalences and Inequalities, almost didn't happen. Some of you might recall that it was originally scheduled as an in-person meeting at the end of April. We sent out acceptances on March 6th, knowing that the realities on the ground were changing day by day, sometimes hour by hour. On March 12th, after a great deal of fretting, we made the difficult decision to cancel the in-person meeting, just as so many other event organizers were doing at that moment, adding to what felt to many of us like an avalanche of cancellations. 1 week after we sent out that email, any lingering ambivalence on our part was neutralized by Governor Newsom's statewide shelter-in-place order. So I bring all of this up, this timeline for leading up to the symposium today, which I'm so delighted is happening. I bring this all up to highlight the epistemological gulf that we've all traversed in the months since March. A lot has happened since then. We're different people than we were back then. The world is a different place. Some of us might even feel that the nature of speculation itself has undergone a change from what it was in March, when in retrospect, we were entirely rudderless, unsure even if masks were effective. And that was before the protests, and before the fires, and before the Twitter ravings of a sociopath hooped up on dexamethasone. So at the very least, the act of speculating feels very different today than what it was in 2018, when our collective was first convened. And for evidence of this, I want to read you the first sentence of our grant proposal. Quote, dystopian visions of disastrous futures, a ruined planet, racial conflict, and polarizing global inequalities are ubiquitous today in popular culture and policy predictions. I'll read that one more time. Dystopian visions of disastrous futures, a ruined planet, racial conflict, and polarizing global inequalities are ubiquitous today in popular culture and policy predictions. If we were to compose this sentence today, then we probably would have ended it at ubiquitous. Dystopian, disastrous, and ruined now read like an adjectival insistence, redundant terms for an everyday reality that's so infuriatingly American in character. Like red blood cells rushing to a wound, or disaster capitalists rushing to exploit a crisis, Can we really say at this moment that we can know or think anything but the wound, anything but the crisis? The edges of that wound have seemed very much to coincide with the US border, with its robotic walls, cages, and world-leading infection rates and case fatality numbers today. But the wound is not the world, and we weren't being naive back in 2018 when we submitted our proposal. The crises that have swept over us this year, like a wildfire, are nothing new, even if their simultaneity feels like an unprecedented conjuncture. We've always been here, and for many of us, American history has never been anything but a history of apocalypse. So there's no reason to give up now, and there's no reason to give into US exceptionalism, even as a critical trope. If anything was clearer to us in 2018, it was that thinnest of air spaces between the actual and critical thought, that little bit of wiggle room that the speculative can breathe into like a bellows and inflate into worlds, galaxies, and universes. We need to insist on the speculative, if not as a refurbished name for the creative imagination, then as a name for that precious space-time that is the prerequisite for emancipation's first move. If we can take this as a restatement of the Speculative Futures Collective's mission, then what we'll be insisting upon over these next 4 weeks under the banner of Transnational Equivalences and Inequalities is that emancipation hates a border. Okay, so some thank yous before we begin. I really need to thank Patrick Coleman and the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination at UCSD for their tremendous help, to the UCI School of Humanities, and especially to Aaron DeFries and Dwayne Pack. Thanks to the UCI Department of English for its sponsorship, and to my co-PI, Shelley Strebe, Nalo Hopkinson, Neda Atanasowski, and to our amazing GSRs, Melanie West and Stephanie Martinez. And lastly, thanks so much to all of you for taking a break from your doom scrolling and your West Wing COVID outbreak watching to join us today for Carceral Bodies. Okay, so just a few quick housekeeping items before I introduce our first presenters. So as you've all noticed, we're using a regular Zoom meeting for this panel. And please note that it is being recorded, and we're gonna make that video recording available on the Speculative Futures website at a future date. So the format of the panel is we'll hold off on questions until after the final presentation. And in the meantime, I've turned off the chat function, and I ask everybody to mute their audio. But when we do transition to the Q&A, I'll open up the chat so you can submit questions that way. And when you ask questions, and I'll remind everybody when we get to Q&A, when you ask questions, I do ask that folks turn on their video. Unfortunately, we're not, that feature of conferences, that, being in person and be able to put faces to names is something that is going to be a little bit more difficult over Zoom, obviously, but we're going to try to approximate it as best we can. So thank you for your patience. Okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce our first presenters who are in fact co-presenting. And we're just going to go on the order in the program. So Sherryl Vint is Professor of Media and Cultural Studies at the University of California, Riverside, where she directs the Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science program. She has published widely, very widely on SF, including most recently Biopolitical Futures in 21st Century Speculative Fiction. Cheryl's co-presenter, Jonathan Alexander, is Chancellor's Professor of English and Informatics at UCI, where he's also Associate Dean in the Division of Undergraduate Education. The author, co-author, or co-editor of 16 books, Alexander is currently researching amateur storytelling and the circulation of personal narrative as forms of rhetorical and political engagement. So without further ado, I'll ask Sherryl and Jonathan to unmute themselves and take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Chris, for that introduction, which was both lovely and sobering, and we're delighted to be here at this symposium. I'm looking forward to hearing all of the presentations and participating in robust conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started and share my screen with my slide deck. So hopefully everybody will be able to see the presentation now. I will rely on Chris to let me know if there are problems. So, all right, excellent. The title of our presentation is The Handmaid's Tale and the Queer Anthropocene. The immense popularity of Hulu's The Handmaid's Tale speaks considerably to current fears of the rise of fascism, ethno-nationalism, the worst kind of retrograde gender politics, and the reassertion into the highest levels of American government of white supremacist Christian beliefs. Indeed, the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the US Supreme Court and her membership in a charismatic Catholic organization in which women called handmaids are admonished to submit to the leadership of their husbands lends at least symbolic timeliness to the renewed interest in and televisual adaptation of Atwood's 1985 novel. But we also note the ways in which both the original novel and the Hulu adaptation is a story of the Anthropocene, a narrative in which changes in the environment have somehow started drastically limiting the human birth rate. Interestingly enough, in the third season of the adaptation, Serena Joy defends Gilead's draconian gender and sexual politics to the Mexican ambassador, whose country is considering adopting the handmaid practice, by saying that her country has reduced its carbon footprint by 78% in 3 years. Curiously, that linkage of a sexual politics based on a form of non-monogamy and an attention to environmental caretaking suggests that even a dystopic imaginary of radically fascist social organization can contain within it elements that are otherwise associated with more progressivist politics and values, such as ecological awareness or non-normative sexual practices. Obviously, both are marshaled in this text for fascist ends, but their appearance in The Handmaid's Tale begs a question. What might a queer approach to the Anthropocene be? And how might we use The Handmaid's Tale to explore such a question? An obvious starting point in answering might hinge on Lee Edelman's famous critique of the dominant figure of the child in organizing and maintaining heteronormative social organization. In his polemical book, No Future, Edelman sees an investment in futurity as one of the most pervasive hegemonic dimensions of heteronormativity, which requires that we sacrifice our current pleasures and possibilities so that we can ensure better futures for children. Such better futures, though, rarely include expansive notions of intimacy and love, but rather focus on the maintenance of socially stabilizing family norms. And indeed, Gilead's social, sexual, and gender politics in The Handmaid's Tale is all about the sacrificing of pleasure, even for some of the male commanders whose desires are non-normative or reproductive, in the pursuit of making children to replenish the population. I'm actually reminded that one of the most disturbing scenes for me in The Handmaid's Tale, I think occurs in season 3, in which one of the commanders, a white man, has been found being filleted by his handmaid, is punished by having part of his arm removed. Another interesting queer dimension of this narrative emerges in the television show's representation itself of queer characters. Fascist, state-sponsored homophobia and anti-queerness remain constant across Atwood's original novel and Hulu's depiction of Gilead, but a major difference between the two narratives is the latter's active inclusion of queer characters, the development of storylines about them, and most notably, the assumption of an anti-Gilead liberal approach to an acceptance of queerness outside the boundaries of the former US, most notably in Canada, which serves as a refuge for Gileadans fleeing sexual, gender, and political oppression. In essence, queer identity becomes a transnational remnant signifying freedom and democracy, kinds of freedom and democracy left behind in the collapse of the United States and the emergence of Gilead. Jasbir Puar, amongst others, has usefully critiqued this yoking of the acceptance of gays and lesbians with liberal attitudes of freedom and democracy as a form of homo-nationalism, a deployment of sexual identity tolerance that serves as a kind of virtue signaling while essentially erasing racial histories of sexual and sexualized violence and oppression. Indeed, Atwood has famously said that there's nothing that occurs to characters in her original novel that hasn't actually occurred to people throughout history. But her use of predominantly white characters in a casting that largely persists in the Hulu adaptation completely elides the fact that the kinds of sexualized violence depicted in the narrative against white women has largely happened historically against women of color and indigenous women. Colonial settler oppression of indigenous people throughout this hemisphere frequently occurred through the rape of indigenous populations and the forcing of heteronormative familial structures on native peoples. Atwood, and by extension Hulu's failure to acknowledge these histories, makes the apocalyptic scenarios of The Handmaid's Tale an apocalypse for mostly white women, ignoring how previous cultures and races have already been through their own apocalyptic upheavals.
Indeed, the very question of how futurity is bound up with the figure of the child is itself a racialized discourse. As Michelle Murphy analyzes in The Economization of Life, Cold War era discourses of population management, articulated in ways that might be considered environmental in the broadest sense of being concerned with resources and sustainability, were themselves colonial projects ultimately aimed at naturalizing and perpetuating inequality. What they ultimately aimed to protect was less the environment than the economy, which involved the project of racializing life, that is, dividing life into categories of more or less worthy of living, reproducing, and being human, and reinscribing race as a problem of population hinged to the fostering of the economy. We should thus read Gilead's insistence on its right to have children as also informed by this Western fear of the fantasized over-reproduction or so-called over-reproduction of brown and Black peoples in so-called less developed countries, and the fear that their fecundity could both overwhelm Western white global hegemony and undermine the expansion of capital. As Murphy puts it, quote, "Too many of them would derail the good American life of capitalism and white supremacy," end quote. Little wonder then that for the Mexican ambassador, the adoption of the handmaid policy would mean something very different ideologically and historically, hence their decision not to follow through. The failure to acknowledge the real history of racialized and differentiated control of reproduction is one of the most significant failures of Atwood's novel. And while the series attempts to mitigate this with more diverse casting, it remains woefully insufficient. Here it is important that we also take note that take note of the attempt to add more complexity to Serena Joy in the form of a backstory that shows how she lost her own fertility after being wounded when she was to deliver a political speech. And even at that point, it was one in support of fundamentalist Christian right and misogynistic politics. There's an opportunity here for the series to more directly then code Serena Joy's technologically enhanced fertility through the Handmaid program as the theft of fertility, the fertility of other marginalized women. In our own history, these practices happen through a racialized fertility industry, through IVF, surrogacy, and the like. But the series seems to draw back from making this more pointed critique. More importantly, as the recent whistleblower allegations regarding coerced sterilization procedures performed on inmates at ICE detention centers shows, this history is alive as well. It's a crucial part of the ongoing fascist politics of white supremacy that animate the current administration's attack on all kinds of immigration, including statements about making adjustment to birthright citizenship. So this question of the child is deeply bound up with other political questions as well. On one side of the coin is stealing reproductive capacity from racialized and queered peoples. On the other, an insistence on reproduction among the desired population, that is, forcing women to bear these babies. Both erase reproductive freedom, and here we might note that although the series features more diverse casting, the handmaids, however undesirable their politics and gender identities, remain overwhelmingly white.
One queer approach to the situation described in The Handmaid's Tale, and one embraced by several characters, is opting out, a rejection of and flight from Gilead as the answer to addressing declining birth rates. We take the phrase opting out from the title of Mari Ruti's monograph, The Ethics of Opting Out, Queer Theory's Defiant Subjects, in which Ruti works through and critiques Lee Edelman's anti-sociality and embrace of no future. Ruti argues that one of the major hallmarks of contemporary queer theorizing, even encompassing theorizations such as Jack Halberstam's Turn to Failure, and as failure as generative, that is, and Elizabeth Freeman's critique of normativity, is the desire to opt out of organizing structures of life that emphasize and actively promote such things as, quote, capitalist accumulation, normative ethical paradigms, the cultural ethos of good performance and productivity, narcissistic models of self-actualization, the heteronormative family, and related reproductive lifestyles. Gilead obviously only forwards a few of these contemporary values, as it were, but as the characters consider how best to sustain their own lives in the dystopic world of The Handmaid's Tale, opting out, even if through politically resistant suicide, is one way to reject the heteronormative family and reproductive mandates of Gilead. The danger in opting out, however, is a fixation on negativity and critique that fails to forward a more generative sense of the possible. Ruti herself points out that a politics of negativity is devoid of any clear political or ethical vision. It wants to destroy what exists without giving us much of a sense of what should exist. It may, of course, be that offering an alternative political ethical vision is more or less impossible. Perhaps it is not the task of theory to define the future, but merely to critique the present. In principle, I do not have a problem with the idea that the purpose of theory is to show us what is wrong, rather than to tell us what to do. At the same time, I'm more inclined to look for, quote, real life, unquote, reference for my theoretical paradigms than those who believe that theory is, or should be, an imaginative activity wholly divorced from the exigencies of lived reality. Ruti's gesture in this long quotation toward reference in, quote, real life, unquote, and her interest in, quote, what should exist, unquote, open up ways of thinking queerly, not just as a mode of critique of the present, but as a method for thinking critically about futurities, however tentative such speculative thinking must necessarily be.
In The Child to Come, Rebecca Sheldon also focuses our attention on imaginative political work accomplished by the figure of the child as an index of futurity, suggesting other ways through which we might think about possibility, about what should exist. She too notes that a link between the child and futurity arrives by way of eugenics in the 19th century, a period which also saw the invention of a notion of childhood as a time of innocence. The Child for Sheldon inculcates a politics of fixity, the future as the continuation of the present, calling for, quote, management over the future to protect the future's children, end quote. Queerness disrupts this heteronormative logic, a queerness that for Sheldon encompasses not simply reproductive and sexual politics, but also possibilities for cross-species communities, a new way to think about life and its value. Reading the opting out of heteropatriarchal futures in the work of Joanna Russ, Sheldon demonstrates how queerness asks us to reconsider what we mean by the value of life itself, beyond what she calls the erasure of consent in the commitment to generational survival that underscores the deeply gendered dimensions of an allegedly pre-political, pre-discursive value of life. For Sheldon, life as a force embodies a fecundity and potentiality that always exceeds our political and discursive attempts to constrain and channel it, which she calls, quote, the absolute exteriority of life, end quote. And it is this capacity of life that offers a point for thinking through the biopolitics of the Anthropocene for Sheldon, who argues, in the hyper-stimulative environment of late capital, in which the acceleration of nature's metabolism has triggered unpredictable vibrancies ramifying across complex systems, what we see erupting is not the increased world-forming powers of the anthropos, but the autonomy and wayward causalities of the planet. The catastrophe for biopolitics inaugurated by the Anthropocene expresses itself first and foremost as the release of Zoe from the anthropological machine that relies on it.
At this point, we might find it useful to turn to a queer indigenous critique of The Handmaid's Tale. Kim Tallbear, a queer indigenous Canadian scholar, has recently contributed to Adele Clark and Donna Haraway's Making Kin, Not Population, joining other scholars in critiquing the heteronormative drives toward reproduction and human expansion that contribute significantly to climate change. She points out in particular how the monogamous couple form has largely been one foisted on indigenous populations by Western colonial settlers, with indigenous kinship practices and non-monogamities stigmatized, forbidden, and punished even to this day. She describes the ways in which indigenous children were often taken from their extended families to be raised by white settlers, a grotesque practice replicated by Gileadan commanders who take others' offspring to raise as their own, even as the narrative largely erases the racial histories of such a practice. Most interestingly for us, Tallbear asserts that, particularly at this time of anthropogenic assault on the environment, what is needed is less reproduction, more kinship, a radical decentering of the kind of reproductive family that has dominated Western culture and that reaches its logically dystopic heights in The Handmaid's Tale, and that instead focuses on the necessity of making kin with others, other people, other entities, even animals. Tallbear's non-monogamy is in the service of extending pleasure, working the sexual as a modality of creating community and extending kinship. In her words, some indigenous kinship practices might very well be culturally, emotionally, financially, and environmentally more sustainable than the nuclear family, particularly as sex is re-understood as primarily creating ties, not just producing children. Ties in which the caretaking of children is shared and extended across multiple people, multiple relations.
Tallbear offers a vision of the capacities of Zoe, celebrated by Sheldon, the potentialities of life that exceed biopolitical structures that seek to discipline life in ways that make it productive for capital, oriented towards the heteronormative family, and most importantly, functioning in the service of white supremacy. And here we might notice that even attempts to introduce queer storylines in the series fail to question the presumed value of coupled biological reproduction. The story of Emily and her wife Sylvia focuses substantially on their son Oliver. And we need to be clear that we find much to admire in the inclusion of a story about a queer couple, especially on the focus of the state's biopolitical management of bodies to its own ends that we see in the storyline about Emily's clitoridectomy as simultaneously a punishment for her queerness and an attempt to manage sexuality such that it is only reproductive, not associated with pleasure. While this is a different procedure from the coerced sterilizations we discussed above, it partakes of a similar logic of state management. The story of Emily's trauma and the difficult reunion with Sylvia that recognizes how her capacities for sociality and intimacy have been damaged by the long-term abuse of her body offers a valuable perspective on why the politics of opting out have such attraction. But despite admiring these parts of the storyline, however, it's contextualized in the larger story of control of women's reproductive capacity along racialized dynamics. So the decision to have this couple be homonormative in the sense of being a stable dyad focused on raising their son raises for us other concerns. They're separated initially because Sylvia possesses a Canadian passport and can cross the border while Emily does not. In this instance, the child provides the motivation for Sylvia to leave. The child must be saved at all costs, even the cost of their relationship. Later, when Emily is able to cross the border, she does so with the assistance from the underground, less for her own sake, and more because she crosses as an escort for June's daughter, Nicole. And in the most recent season that follows Nicole's relocation, she becomes a transnational celebrity of sorts, again, focusing reproductive futurity as the central theme that the series is invested in, and not acknowledging its fascist investments in white reproduction.
Ultimately, perhaps the most queer approach to the Anthropocene of The Handmaid's Tale might focus less on the fate of people with particular identities and far more on deeply questioning the assumption of the necessity of family and human reproduction, and how such an unexamined assumption supports the rise of fascism. Even more, a queer approach might want to imagine the Anthropocene of these narratives as an opportunity to unseat human reproduction as the necessary or even desirable focus of our response to declining birth rates specifically, and to the human impact on the environment more broadly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Sherryl, for that wonderful presentation. So next up, we have Juan Carlos J.C. Fermin, who is a second-year English PhD student here at UCI. His areas of focus are post-colonial theory and the Philippine diaspora, and he's also become an avid student of Afro-pessimism, the decolonial feminisms, and non-Western radical traditions. JC is a founding member of UCI's Critical Race Reading Group, an organization that promotes a sustained and necessary dialogue on race. In his graduate career, JC has previously presented at Sense and Consensus at Berkeley Stanford English Graduate Conference, and his treatise on Afro-pessimism and Marxism is forthcoming in the journal International Labor and Working Class Theory. So JC, I'm going to promote you to a co-host, and you can take it away from there.
Sure, thanks, Chris. So let me share my screen. Let me see. Okay, so my presentation, everybody, is titled In Keeping with Ornamentalism, Asiatic Femininity on Such a Full Sea. Set in a sprawling post-apocalyptic America, Chang Rae Lee's 2014 novel On Such a Full Sea is laden with dystopian representations that disturbingly parallel the present day. In a world marred by environmental decay, a small elite class enjoys the privilege of dwelling in charters, settlements which contain the last bastions of modernity. As an inevitability of late-stage capitalism, charters rely on labor colonies to sustain their prosperity, and Fan, the protagonist, comes from the labor colony of Beemore, some future Baltimore. Late in the novel, Fan's misadventures lead her into the custody of Miss Cathy, a wealthy older white woman who has also formed a habit of keeping young women. The girls, as the narration calls them, are all around the same age and of some kind of Asian blood, confined to a secret living space within Miss Cathy and her decrepit husband's villa. Before Fan eventually escapes, she is forced to confront the possibility of joining the 7 other girls in captivity. On Such a Full Sea thus offers a speculative depiction of a racial form that invites comparison to its real counterparts, primarily in the way that Western eyes represent and attempt to contain Asiatic femininity. In the 2019 book, Ornamentalism, author Anlin Chang offers a theory of Asiatic feminism that exposes the real-world ideological underpinnings of the very same fetishization Lee critiques. Chang reveals the particular ways in which Asian women are objectified or ornamentalized by the Western culture industry, while Lee's novel depicts a horrific manifestation of this same tendency. Chang's work animates a reading of On Such a Full Sea that not only highlights the immediacy of the girl's situation, but also reifies the novel's unique position in its own genre. Its world-building forms a critique of capital and the inequalities that sustain and are sustained by it. One such inequality is indeed the vulnerability of the girls, who, for their raced and sexed bodies, are rendered mere ornaments by those who would possess them. Chang's work is in dialogue with Edward Said's 1978 book, Orientalism, which focuses on how the empires of Britain and France represented their colonized subjects through academia and mass culture. Chang's intervention in ornamentalism offers a framework with which to understand the objectification and subsequent othering of Asian female bodies like that of the girls. In particular, Chang brings attention to the strange figuration of the yellow woman, a racial and gendered figure whose flesh lines survives through abstract and synthetic rather than organic means. Even when Western hegemonic structures deprive a colonized subject of their agential powers in various ways, juxtaposing an enlightened West with a primitive East remains predicated on the Eastern other's corporeality. There remains a body for the Westerner to discipline and subjugate. For the Asian female body, however, Chang argues that it suffers from a specific kind of abstraction under Western eyes. A body may exist to be disciplined and subjugated, but an image or representation of said body monopolizes the Westerner's attention and all the possibilities they can conceive of it. Thus, to address the unique objectification of the Asian female body that Chang describes, Her intervention is in service of forming an emergent yellow feminist theory, which serves to detach us from the ideal of a natural and an agential personhood that invariably accompanies critiques of power and from which the Asiatic woman is always already foreclosed, and to contend that the discourse of Asiatic femininity, at once pervasive and marginal, enhancing and disparaging, dated and yet contemporary, is part of a much larger debate about beauty and violence, as well as about life and artificiality, nestled in the making of modern Euro-American personhood. Said's Orientalism attends to Western Empire's discursive misrepresentations of colonized subjects. He is not making truth claims about Orientalized populations, but about the ways Western institutions claim ostensible knowledge over them. In all this, the personhood of the Saidian Oriental still exists independently of the Western Orientalists' imputations. In Cheng's Ornamentalism, however, she argues that the affordances of personhood are always already foreclosed from the yellow woman. For Cheng, the presumption of a natural and an agential personhood is theoretically unproductive. The presumption of the yellow woman's personhood would be inadequate for reckoning with the repression she faces, repression in the form of the totalizing ontology prescribed to her. For as far as the Western observer is concerned, the yellow woman's objectification and aestheticization are her ontology. Euro-American personhood appears to be predicated on the lesser personhood of the ornamentalized yellow woman, among other repressed racial forms. Like Said, then, Cheng examines how Western ontologies constitute themselves vis-a-vis a racialized other, in her case, the ornamentalized yellow woman. So, in Fan's encounters with Miss Cathy and the girls, after all, Lee's novel demonstrates ornamentalism as Cheng has defined it thus far. Miss Cathy's personhood seems predicated on her objectification of the girls in contrast. When Fan is confined with the girls for the first time, she observes their identically altered eyes that initially made it harder to differentiate them, and reflects on having heard of the practice of girls and boys doing this long, long ago to make themselves look like their favorite anime characters. Now, anime characters are already necessarily abstractions of any real person. Often designed to be simplistic and or visually appealing, anime characters are as prone to idealization and fetishization as their Western comic book counterparts. Certain female anime characters, popularly understood to be kawaii or cute, can become frames of reference for Westerners to fetishize Asian female bodies. The fetishizing itself can even be self-inflicted, as Fan remarks that early on, apparently girls 1 and 2 had asked Miss Cathy if they could have their eyes done, only for each successive girl to want it as soon as their arrival. When the girls make bodily alterations to resemble anime characters, they are appealing to a standard of attractiveness they have internalized despite its underlying foundations in fetishization. Fittingly, Cheng says that the ornamentalized woman is one whose personhood is animated through, rather than eviscerated by, aesthetic congealment. By partaking in this aesthetic congealment, the girls essentially ornamentalize themselves. They do not appeal to a recognition of their authentic personhoods, but to images or ideal types of what they consider the most palatable representations of themselves. These are merely facsimiles of their authentic personhoods, but it's these facsimiles that are most palatable to Miss Cathy. With this example, Lee is not only alluding to the domestic and international popularity of anime in the present day, but also to the cultural effects of certain archetypes within anime, archetypes seemingly tailored towards said fetishization. Lee is certainly not critiquing the entirety of anime as an artistic medium. He and I are not at all denying the medium's merits. Rather, in Lee's choice to include anime-styled eye modifications as a cultural phenomenon in this novel, he attends to problematic elements of anime that have been compounded by Western commodification and consumption. And though the girls requested the eye alterations, those alterations ultimately gratify a fetishizing that Miss Cathy indulges in and that the girls themselves have internalized. For indeed, Miss Cathy places immense value on Fan and the girls' fetishized essences. The act of keeping, which Fan considers an uncommon but growing charter practice, means the girls are lodged in the same way beloved pets were once kept by their owners, who, of course, did not query them as to what they might desire. Likening the girl's treatment to that of beloved pets already insinuates the disturbing power imbalance connoted by interactions with the cute and kawaii. Keeping is therefore a manifestation of these qualities at their worst, what with Miss Kathy preying upon the vulnerability and meekness of her cute/kawaii trinkets, her beloved pets. For her, the girls are a source of an unusually intense and yet strangely ambivalent kind of empathy, or what scholar Shan Nai would consider an evocation of cuteness. For while an unusual intensity is required for Miss Kathy to seek out and maintain girls to keep, she nonetheless exercises an ambivalent kind of empathy in her superficial yet maternalistic affection for the girls. Miss Kathy still shelters and provides for the same young women she objectifies. While Miss Kathy's attitude is likely common among those of the charter elite who practice keeping, her example is an egregious display of how far keeping can go. She indulges in the kawaii and the cute by condoning the girls' eye alterations, what with their bizarrely large eyes, making them look deeply attentive, like some puppy or doe who craves only your company and succor. Even if girls wanted to, initially chose to be modified as such, they likely did not understand the ultimate implications of the gesture. By unwittingly giving in to the paradigms set through those aesthetic categories, the girls subject themselves to the power imbalance those same categories inevitably entail. If the girls' material conditions matter to Miss Kathy as much as their images do, she would not manage their lives so clandestinely and almost negligently so. Fan observes that Mala, Miss Kathy's maid, would sometimes receive an extra order of foodstuffs from the delivery van and put it away herself in one of the pantries of the house kitchen. These foodstuffs are then sent up to the girls via dumbwaiter that opened up into their small but functional galley kitchen near the bathroom, where they prepared their own meals. Because Mala is a Southeast Asian coded servant, there's an analysis of her fraught position that's beyond the scope of this presentation. But the secret Mala keeps for Miss Kathy and her surreptitious approach to feeding the girls speak to Miss Kathy's unspoken culpability. Likewise, the secrecy at hand only reinforces the power imbalance between her and the girls. They are at the mercy of a system Miss Kathy has instituted, providing the barest standards of living so they can continue to serve her. Miss Kathy even prescribes recreational routines to the girls. For exercise, the girls practiced a special mix of Tai Chi and yoga that Miss Kathy had read about in a magazine and instituted into their day, though they all suffered to varying degrees from sore joints and fragile bones and periodic bouts of an intense, dragging weariness that Fan would later learn were all caused by lack of sunlight. The lack of sunlight and the girls' resulting vitamin D deficiencies are already blameworthy enough, but Miss Kathy's cursory glance at Tai Chi and yoga is indicative of her ornamentalist gaze. Without any evidence in the narrative to suggest Miss Kathy sought after authentic Tai Chi and yoga instruction for the girls, the mere Easternness of these disciplines suffice for Miss Kathy to make them compulsory. After all, it is enough for Miss Kathy alone to represent and perceive what the girls are supposed to be. Her Westernness is the only frame of reference she needs. She imposes this compulsory exercise regimen not only to reaffirm the girls' Easternness, but also to reinforce her control over their very bodies. Eminently infantilized while in Miss Kathy's custody, the girls are not only denied any acknowledgement of their interiority, but also given few opportunities with which to apprehend said interiority for themselves. Barring an example I will discuss later, the girls' stunted and sheltered upbringings prevent them from articulating a way of life without Miss Kathy's authority, as if their possibilities only extend as far as she allows. The same applies to Chang's framework for the yellow woman, who denotes a person but connotes a style, promising yet supplanting skin and flesh, an insistently aesthetic presence that is prized and despoiled. The girls' personhoods are overshadowed by how they appear and what they represent, Miss Kathy imputing disproportionate value to the images they project, facsimiles of personhoods. As far as Miss Kathy is concerned, the girls exist to be pampered and sheltered, cute objects pliable to every whim of their keeper. When Fan likens victims of keeping to beloved pets, the pets in question must be those whose owners treat like accessories, such as chihuahuas that fit in purses. Though Miss Cathy does not utilize the girls as a public status symbol, though that would also be disturbing, the fact she has the means to keep them at all denotes her high status. As illustrated by the girls' example, an ornamentalized other is thus victim to an elegant, that is to say, seamless alchemy between things and persons. In the girls' case, they are suspended between their own corporeality and what Miss Cathy prizes about them, distorted, fetishized impressions of their Asiatic femininity, ornamental in their kawaii affectations and pet-like servitude. Somehow, the girls are both objectified people and personified objects. Being both is why Miss Cathy keeps them. But that claim of Miss Cathy's sole sovereignty is not true. Before Fan's arrival, Miss Cathy's husband, Mr. Leo, is shown to not only have been aware of the girls' existence, but also to have played a disturbingly involved role in their lives. Although Mr. Leo has a stroke and is reduced to a vegetative state before Fan meets the girls, Fan later discovers murals the girls have made with magic marker, montages of their experiences in captivity. The scenes with Leo were moodier, of course, but no less finely executed. The noteworthy detail about his panels was that he never appeared whole, but rather as an insinuation or part. In one scene, for example, of one of the girls ironing napkins in the kitchen, a line of wine goblets on the shelf behind her kept watch, their bellies twinkling with his eyes. Or another, showing three vacuuming the seat of a stuffed chair whose arms looked just like his, right down to the stout pink finger. Or just Mr. Leo's mouth, 5 o'clock shadowed, saying here through his heavy, almost womanly lips. From the girls' art, Mr. Leo appears as a figure haunting the periphery of their experiences. It is not difficult to imagine why illustrations including him are moodier than those without him. His surveillance via the wine goblets attests to his once constant presence, however unwarranted. His arm's identicality to the arms of a stuffed chair that Three hovers over could be a visual repression of a sexual act she was coerced to perform. The word here emerging from Mr. Leo's mouth could be a command he often uttered to any of the girls in his thrall. When Chang remarks that the yellow woman is persistently sexualized, yet barred from sexuality, it is Mr. Leo who sexualizes the girls, and Miss Cathy who bars them from sexuality. In tandem, the affluent couple reinforces the very structure of ornamentalism. Miss Cathy and Mr. Leo also represent the only case of the charter practice of keeping that is explored in the novel. From a world-building perspective, however, keeping's growing state is far from reassuring. This speaks not only to keeping's ubiquity, but also to the power imbalance it reflects between charters and labor colonies, from which the girls likely originated, as well as to the pervasiveness of an ornamentalism that objectifies and sexualizes them. This is also in keeping with the basic tenets of 19th century Orientalism. Opulence and sensuality are the signature components of Asiatic character. Asia is always ancient, excessive, feminine, open for use and decadent. Material consumption promises cultural possession. Lee's depiction of the girl's situation resonates with Chang's observations about the ornamentalized yellow woman. Despite the vagueness of their respective Asian descents, the girls nonetheless carry the Asiatic character that Chang speaks of. Sheltered in secret, the girls are made perpetually open for use to both Miss Cathy and Mr. Leo, whose material consumption thereof promises cultural possession indeed. Miss Cathy effectively consumes the girls as ornamentalized objects in the way she controls them, commanding their loyalty and affection. Until Mr. Leo's fateful stroke, he performs an entirely different, if not doubly insidious, material consumption, his use of the girls as sex objects to ornamentalize them as well. So long as they remain in the couple's custody, the girls are perpetually subject to their scrutiny, their interventions, and their fantasies. Just as Chang says that there is no room in the Orientalist imagination for national, ethnic, or historical specificities, there is no room in Miss Cathy and Mr. Leo's imaginations for the material origins of each girl, the labor colony she was taken from, and the family she wants to belong to but could never have remembered. All that the girl's keepers can imagine is all that the ornamentalist can, a mere simulacrum of a young Asian woman, othered, commodified, and divorced of any coherence beyond what the Westerner imputes. In On Such a Full Sea, the power imbalance between charters and labor colonies is thus never solely about class. Lee writes the practice of keeping into this novel to establish how racialized power imbalances not only continue in the story's hyper-capitalist dystopia, but also how these inequalities flourish in its decadence. And that's all. Thank you guys for listening. Special thanks to Dr. Fan again for managing this entire symposium, and to Dr. Radhakrishnan for being my advisor. So thank you guys.
Casey, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. So next up we have Trisha Remetir, who is a PhD candidate in English and Comparative Literature at UNC Chapel Hill. Her dissertation is about territorialism and fishing in the Philippines from the 1970s to today. So Trisha, I believe you are co-hosted, so go ahead and take it away.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm sharing my screen, and yeah. In 2003, Catherine Sinisa Choi published a book addressing the complicated histories of nursing's role in US colonialism and the racialization of Filipinos in the US. Her project, Empire of Care, sparked a long-term engagement with the profession of nursing as a globally sourced and racialized labor network in which Filipinos took part. The Empire of Care refers to a transnational migration pattern in which professional nurses from the Philippines migrated, worked, and settled in developed countries. So lately I feel the need to revisit this text as I ask how nursing and the broader field of healthcare plays a role in the prison industrial complex, or PIC. COVID-19's effects on communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous communities, and the continued reckoning of anti-Black police killings this year, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor to many more, shows that a discussion of healthcare's investments in the carceral state is long overdue. The critiques against the healthcare system are not new, from the Young Lords' occupation of Lincoln Hospital in 1970 to Assata Shakur's description of how doctors and nurses willingly cooperated with the police while she was under arrest. Now's yet another opportunity, really, to rethink our investments in the carceral state. And so far, in Filipino studies, where transnational care and nursing are topics of concern, not much has been said about how nurses are conscripted into these systems. So the purpose of this talk then really is to ask the uncomfortable question, where does the empire of care meet the carceral state? I draw evidence from an extremely personal site to me, Patton State Hospital, near where I grew up and also where I know people who worked. Patton State Hospital is a forensic psychiatric hospital in Southern California that admits offenders considered by the legal system to be quote unquote criminally insane. Founded in 1893, Patton served as a premier hospital for the greater LA area. And its founding was also crucial to the early development of San Bernardino, both the city and the county. As Patton changed its brand from insane asylum to state hospital and started to exclusively work with the California's prison population around the 70s, Patton joined other state hospitals to form the California State Hospital System. Now, according to the Department of State Hospitals mission statement, these institutions are supposed to strive to provide effective treatment in a safe environment and in a fiscally responsible manner. Of course, this mission statement hides the carceral system over which this hospital operates. Today, state hospitals work with the police, collaborating with them on a daily basis, and even more distressing, as of August 13, 2020, Patton State Hospital announced a breakout of over 250 COVID-19 infections in both patients and staff. So let it be clear, really, that Patton State Hospital is a prison in spite of its name. And like most hospitals in California and in the US, it's a key source of employment for much of the Filipino diaspora. So in this talk, I want to show how nursing and healthcare more broadly are locked in relation to US carceral systems. Though hard to notice at first, we do get glimpses of their entanglement in popular and critical discussions on Filipino care work in city and state demographics of California nurses broken down by race, and also in the San Bernardino County Police Department budget itself. So this is all to say, really, that Patton State Hospital and forensic hospitals are presented as this carceral exception to the healthcare industry. when in fact its history, abuses, and commitment to the incapacitation of unwanted subjects, drawing from Ruth Wilson Gilmore's writings, cements healthcare's connections to the carceral state. Moreover, as Patton State Hospital is undoubtedly part of the empire of care, this problem seeps out of Southern California and touches other geographies and class categories. So the larger project of this essay is indebted to conversations I've had with those in my community in North Carolina and in California, with influenced really by Ruth Wilson Gilmore's writings and also with Dylan Rodriguez's writings on abolition and also Filipino American discourse. And I also want to be absolutely clear that presenting this work is in no way the same as the work that the abolitionist communities in San Bernardino are doing in the streets. So at the end of this slideshow, I leave a list of Venmos of abolitionist orgs in San Bernardino that I encourage you to donate to and contribute to if you have the means to. So in this public health crisis, it's easy to throw around ideas of care without really interrogating what we mean by them. This includes related terms like care networks, pod mapping, mutual aid. They're all becoming widely discussed. And it's important to continually remind ourselves that these terms originated from movement workers in disability justice, the Black radical tradition, prison abolition work, and more. Likewise, writers in critical Filipino studies have had a long tradition of making clear what radical care can be and what it is definitely not. Radical care is not the profession of nursing, since we can't forget that the profession of nursing is exactly that. It's wage labor. It's not a cultural tradition, and it's not an inherent cultural trait. But radical care can appear fleetingly in the in-between spaces of where transnational workers live and work. Sunday beauty pageants in Hong Kong, for example, domestic care crisis organizations, alternate kinship formations. As the work of Rosal Pereñas, Martin Manalansan, and other Filipino studies scholars make clear, care, or what I sum up to be as my definition now of care as the creation and maintenance of life through solidarity, is not found in the workplace, and it's not found in racialized stereotypes of a friendly, gendered Filipino laborer. So the type of care that I'm isolating in this talk is actually the care in healthcare, the work category. An estimated 4%, or about 150,000 nurses in the US are Filipino. And other statistics note that in California, nearly 20% of registered nurses are Filipinos. This doesn't count the Filipinos who are also informally employed in the US as caregivers. Regardless, these statistics simply point out that the US healthcare system is embedded in transnational processes, again connecting to Choi's thesis that healthcare is an empire. And this would lead me really to the next question, which is, where do writings about care in the prison state exist in Filipino diasporic work? Jennifer Wofford's MacArthur Nurses is a 4-panel acrylic on canvas painting that depicts the role of Filipino nurses subject to these transnational processes. So in this muted artwork, nurses are dressed in World War II nursing uniforms, and they look as if they're marching out of water. The title of the piece refers to Douglas MacArthur, Field Marshal of the Philippine Army and the US in the 40s and 50s. And I would also say that this naming really creates this visual connection between the profession of nursing and that of the history of militarism in the Pacific. So, this makes me wonder, though I haven't found much yet, whether or not there are equal connections between Filipino nurses and prisons and policing happening in the US, the place of work. The Alex Tizon article, My Family's Slave, published in 2017, was an autobiographical piece about how Tizon's family kept Eudocia Tomas Pulido as a non-paid, undocumented caregiver in the family for decades. Upon publication, the article garnered critiques about its ethics of telling Pulido's story, more critiques about the author's ethics behind asking for redemption, and also the use of the word slave in the article's title. In this tale, though, one additional detail stood out to me. that his mother was a doctor who worked at a state institution, Fairview Training Center in Oregon to be exact. And I found precisely one tweet that has addressed this idea, that not only was Tizon's telling of Eudocia's story doubly transnational, in that it doesn't just address the strain of coerced labor in immigrant families. This abusive labor practice is interlocked and even funded by his mother's employment in the state hospital system. So Ruth Wilson Gilmore wrote in Golden Gulag, incapacitation underwriting prison systems in the US is not just an incapacitation of undesirable individuals via making them do no harm. It also involves moving undesirable individuals to undesirable geographic locations, cutting off access to quote unquote do no harm, and also cutting off access to asking for help. Tizon's mother's employment reminds me of a quote from Martin Manalansan, an article written in 2008, that really there needs to be an expansion of our ideas of care work, with the first step being decoupling the biological mother from the notion of care. And then also with this project, I would also ask, how can our analyses of care encompass and take responsibility for carceral logic that pops up in transnational immigrant stories? And then also what needs to really change in the way we notice ourselves in these narratives to allow for this kind of conversation. So perhaps these critiques aren't yet found in literature. So I want to put a pin in that thought as I turn to the last object of my study, which is actually a workplace. So Patton State Hospital both grounds San Bernardino in the economic sense, and also in terms of the carceral logic of incapacitation via mental health stigmas. So the hospital remains, Patton actually remains one of the longest standing commitments to state carceral systems in the region. There's so much behind, beyond this timeline, but here's just a timeline of some of the documented abuses at Patton State, including the building over indigenous land in the 1890s. And also for nearly 3 decades in the early 20th century, Patton performed forced sterilizations, which was eventually outlawed in 1979 in California. In fact, archival work by people such as Alexandra Stern is still being produced about some of the survivors, still living survivors of sterilization. And this, of course, connects to recent events in which Dawn Wooten, an African-American nurse, exposed sterilization hysterectomies happening in ICE detention centers. So this remains just a deeply relevant part of what we're talking about now, really. In the 1970s, after a period of deinstitutionalization, Patton starts to admit maximum security patients. And this also coincides with the influx of Filipino nurses into the US after the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. Now, another thing that I would like to focus on is the 2006 to 2011 scandal. So following a string of documented patient abuse and assault by staff, the US Department of Justice ordered a 5-year period of federal oversight on Patton. In a letter addressing these abuses, they stated that Patton failed on the levels of protection from harm, adequate psychiatric care, behavioral treatment, and more. And additionally, they found that Patton staff frequently used restraints and seclusion as a first course of action and overprescribed psychiatric drugs, among many, many other offenses. Now, the operational word that the Justice Department used over and over again to recommend oversight is this phrase, that workers at Patton State deviated from the standard notions of care. While yes, this is an industry-wide term, what's chilling is that once those notions of care were determined to be met, i.e. that minimum changes were made and the federal oversight period ended investigations, Patton closed access to most of its archives and data sets. So this is particularly troubling since, just like prisons in California, it remains a black box of information. And geographically, Patton has been a grounding spot for the otherwise failing economy of San Bernardino, the city and county. Healthcare remains one of the biggest industries today, aside from logistics, employing 14% of total San Bernardino County workers. Now, it's also important to say that their police unit is not with San Bernardino, the city or the county, but with officers in the California Department of Corrections, again, making clear what type of carceral space this is. And even though it is not involved with the San Bernardino Police Department, public hospitals themselves in San Bernardino are. So the newly bought St. Bernardine Hospital, which is a public hospital in San Bernardino that's now called Dignity Health, entered into a new contract with the San Bernardino Police Department, raising the budget line of working in hospitals for the police department by 92%. So this is all this is all kind of like a lot really to take in, particularly with the just string of abuses that Patton has performed in its space. And I've been really trying to think of ways to understand just the reach of the single site. So I've turned also at some points to Mia Mingus's visual on the medical industrial complex. This strikes a chord because, as you can see here, Mingus, maps the medical industrial complex via 4 missions. So in the corners, science and medicine, health, access, and safety. And Mingus also maps them to its underlying problems: eugenics, desirability, population control, charity, and ableism. As you can see at the bottom right of this visual, the prison industrial complex and prison psychiatric wards are at the bottom right, whereas those who are inhabiting the same space, that is doctors, nurses, and practitioners, are more or less loosely connected to it via biocolonialism and the area of the top left corner, science and medicine. So this is such a useful framework, but for the purposes of this project, it's also really hard to visualize the geographic breadth that just a single medical carceral institution has within its reach. As state hospitals moved to admit maximum security patients in the 70s, it remains a corridor for the California prison system to expand without the earmarking of more land. And lastly, I'm really troubled by this fact that while 20% of nurses in California are Filipino, Filipinos make up 40% of registered nurses employed at the state hospital system, and that number is more at Patton. Filipinos are the largest ethnic demographic at Patton State Hospital, and of course, a highly mobile transnational group. And that money really flows from institutions like these to the Filipino national economy through remittance networks and remittance technologies. So after unteasing a lot of these transnational connections that a single prison might have to the rest of the world, it's kind of hard to wrap up here. Here are the handles of local abolitionist groups doing work in San Bernardino and close by, groups I'm not personally connected to, but are doing amazing work in the area. But as a last note, I'd like to reiterate that Patton State Hospital is not just an example of how healthcare and the prison state are intertwined. Patton's pattern of hiring transnational nurses connects the California and US prison space to the rest of the world, making transnational communities, Filipino communities, complicit, whether or not they realize it or not. But now we know. So as death tolls take a hard hit on this highly transnational class of workers, but most importantly, the prisoners that are supposed to be taken care of in this institution, now more than ever is the time to think about how care can take on more insurgent forms in the abolition of prison, including on the hospital floor.
Trisha, thank you so much for digging deep into that personal history to present all that to us. Lastly, we have Adhy Kim, who will be presenting for us. Adhy is a PhD candidate in comparative literature at UNC Chapel Hill. They research inter-imperial relationships between Japan, Korea, and the United States. And their dissertation is about literary intersections of Cold War memory and speculative natural history. So Adhy.
Okay. I took this picture inside the May 18th Democratization Movement archives in Gwangju, South Korea, where an entire floor is dedicated to UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. 17 World Memory Inheritances, or in Korean, Seige Girokyusan, are featured here. The 518 Archives' main purpose is to commemorate and preserve documentation of the 1980 Gwangju People's Uprising against South Korean military rule, a historic pro-democracy protest that with a police massacre of over 500 students and civilians. In this exhibit, we see several other human rights violations on display. Included are events like the Nanjing Massacre, other memorials like the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum in Cambodia, and military dictatorships in Latin America, all of which were US supported, among others. So these displays are accompanied by a large world picture on the wall, which you see here with each of the 17 memories geographically marked with a yellow dot, while the English and Korean words for peace, democracy, and human rights span the world's oceans. UNESCO's Memory of the World Register intended to preserve cultural and historical materials into a world documentary heritage. Here uses the framework of human rights in its effort to organize collective memories of war and atrocity. Reflecting a post-Cold War trend toward global memory, the Memory of the World imagines a history of one humanity connected to the rhythms of the planet, specifically through the documentation of how human rights have been lost. This map belies the sense that these 17 highlighted areas were randomly chosen among many possible examples. The problem then arises of how one could assign significance to a select number of incommensurable items, especially in a world without any common memory of the past. The human rights framing of shared world space appears to expand its world historical legitimacy when it relates post-1945 state violence to long historical processes like slavery and colonialism. However, the recollection of various human rights violations into a world map of common human heritage raises the question of how the language of human rights can adequately confront histories of imperial and colonial domination. Its emphasis on remembering historical injustice stops short of highlighting specific connections between capitalist empire, state violence around the world, and the ongoing immiseration of the global South attending post-Cold War globalization and neoliberal capitalism. The notion that international human rights is the most authoritative arbiter of universal justice frequently runs up against critiques for its lack of imagination, racist paternalism, exclusion, failure to combat multinational corporations, and so on. As Samuel Moyn has expressed in his book, Not Enough, human rights will never be enough under conditions of neocolonialism and neoliberal capitalism. The insufficiency of human rights discourse to solve capitalist destruction leads us to ask how capitalist violence would endure into the future. How might human rights violations be rehearsed into the future as capitalist repetition? Literary scholars of human rights have long discussed how globalization shapes reading practices, and UNESCO, as the cultural and educational arm of the United Nations, remains in a supportive convergence with the production and curation of world literature. Sarah Bouriette's account of UNESCO's Cold War era literary programs, like the collection of representative works, reveals what she considers to be a literary liberal cosmopolitanism in decline. A strand of post-Cold War global novels could be said to reconfigure UNESCO's representational ideals of global community and memory into narratives of human interconnectedness across far-flung time and space, which skew towards speculative fiction, but could also be described as a kind of capitalist realism. British author David Mitchell's novel Cloud Atlas exemplifies such a narrative. It operates at a scale of world historicity that is interested in representing the persistence of non-democratic unfreedom, against which rights-bearing freedom echoes into the distant future as a melancholic liberal refrain. Under a horizon of possibilities qualified by Cold War and post-Cold War capitalism, a networked human rights novel like Cloud Atlas interrogates, albeit imperfectly, the contradiction between capitalist empire and what liberalism dredges up by association, the conviction that progress is possible even though liberalism would never get there. Of special interest in this novel is a section that takes place in 22nd century Korea and is narrated by a woman service worker without human rights. Mitchell's novel positions Korean capitalism within a longer historical duration that embeds the loss of human rights within environmental crises and transitions in the capitalist world system. So Cloud Atlas is a literary demonstration of a UNESCO-friendly approach to speculative historical memory. It puts South Korea on the map, so to speak. What are the speculative possibilities that arise from considering South Korea's place in world literature and the novel of human rights? The rest of my talk will focus on a work by the contemporary South Korean author Han Gang, arguably the most well-known South Korean author in the Anglophone world. She is from the city of Gwangju, and she writes under the legacy of the 1980 Gwangju uprising. And she has a long-standing interest in militarized violence and how it overlaps with sexual violence against women. A copy of her novel, Soñani Onda, The Boy is Coming, translated into English as Human Acts, is displayed in the 518 archives as part of Gwangju's heritage infrastructure. Human Acts and Han's more well-known novel, The Vegetarian, 채식주의자, could definitely accommodate a liberal human rights perspective. By focusing on the embodiment of suffering, they follow what Elizabeth Anker calls a liberal trajectory of subject formation that relegates the particularly gendered body to a condition of relative captivity, unquote. But if human rights appeals to legal definitions of the human to recuperate the body in pain, Han does not claim that such appeals would be enough. Her novels don't neatly conform to the teleology of post-democratization South Korean liberal capitalism, which would place memories of South Korean human rights violations firmly in the past. Contrary to such promises, capitalist reform and transition have perpetuated human rights violations into the present and likely the future. Han doesn't directly name political alternatives to neoliberal capitalism, nor should she necessarily be called to do so, but it is interesting how her view of global history funnels into speculative thinking on how the colonial and militarized past leads to environmental scales of human destruction. I will draw on a few literary examples. The 5th chapter of Human Acts is narrated by a woman named Sunju, an archivist for environmental crimes. She recalls memories as a young textile factory worker participating in a 1976 sit-in strike, where about 70 striking women workers undressed as the police surrounded them. The police brutally broke up their strike, beating the women with bats until the majority of them lost consciousness and then dragging them to police vans. Such an event exemplifies the hostility of Park Chung-hee's administration toward grassroots union movements, the majority of which were led by women in the 1970s. Sunju recalls the breakup of the strike. Quote, "She didn't forget the face of the plainclothes policeman who stamped on her stomach and kicked her sides. She didn't forget that the central government trained and supported strikebreakers and that at the top of this pyramid of violence was the military president." Unquote. She has a recurring dream where a huge glacier, quote, "a huge glacier presses down on your body. You want to flow beneath it. You must become fluid, whether seawater, oil, or lava, and undress yourself of the weight." Sunju's desire to undress herself, like the striking workers at Dongyo, and become glacial melt, ocean water, or fossil fuel approximates her labor strike to geological materials and processes associated with climate change, the melting of sea ice, ocean acidification, and the continued extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Here, social history and natural history overlap onto the laboring woman's body, which is figured as a geologic archive of unresolved violent events. Brutal labor disciplines, such as what happened at the Dongyo factory, contributed to the anger that fueled the Gwangju uprising after another military dictator replaced Park Chung-hee. Han approaches militarized capitalism as both a human rights problem and a labor problem, both of which take on a gender dimension. While human rights discourse, particularly after the Cold War, have taken up issues of patriarchal violence and sexual violence, labor rights are considered secondary concerns. Human rights and labor rights were more entangled concerns in South Korea leading up to the country's eventual democratization in 1987. This integrated moment has since dissolved under a new regime of capital accumulation, where civil society movements and humanitarian organizations advocate for conditional relief to ultra-precarious laborers while embracing the hegemonic values of private property, citizenship, and the rule of law. The exploitation of labor thus takes on a valence of capitalist repetition through the novel's retrospective tense. If, as Hyunwook Park observes, the neoliberal capitalist ideology of a post-labor society erases labor's objectification and abstraction, Han's flashback to a dramatic 1976 crackdown on women's labor signals not merely an effort to memorialize violence, but also the seeming return of the deadly violence that turns bodies into absolute thingness, as experienced by South Korea's migrant workers and other precarious workers since the decline of citizens' labor activism in the 1990s. Such speculations mean that memories of the violence waged by capitalist powers overlap with future outcomes despite the notion of historical rupture, which assumes that the arrival of new reforms historicizes and thus banishes from the present and future earlier forms of state oppression and class struggle. As Hyunwook Park has diagnosed, the narrative shift in South Korean politics since the late 80s away from collective action toward the rule of law and self-empowerment posits a rupture in South Korean history in order to shore up and integrate capital across national communities. This narrative depends on a correlative cognitive shift from industrial to finance capitalism, which, as Park argues, ignores the contemporary neoliberal entanglement between manufacturing firms and financial institutions designed to maximize profit, lay off workers, and cheapen labor. South Korean neoliberal policies concurrently use the language of human rights and the rule of law to enshrine private property rights as proof of democracy at work. Han's global recognition involves reanimating violated post-colonial bodies that could lend ideological coherence to liberal human rights, while the underlying problems of colonial capitalism and Cold War division remain unsolved. Her use of speculation, like that of Cloud Atlas, veers toward a kind of longue durée capitalist realism. Her two novels form an interesting pair for that reason. They are accounts of capitalist regimes both before and after South Korean democratization, and they inscribe the embodied memory of past human rights violations as outcomes of military capitalism, sustained into the future as a philosophy of history. Her combination of dictatorship period violations and human acts with more contemporary forms of gender violence in the vegetarian overlaps time. South Korea, as a sub-empire of global capitalism, accesses the language of human rights in order to invoke flashbacks to previous labor struggle. I end by pointing to a section in Han's novel, The Vegetarian, which could be considered an extended speculative fiction of a woman turning into a plant. A character in the novel engages in some speculation about her sister's flowering condition as a symptom of a transitional environment for species to mutate and adapt on an accelerated scale. This shortly leads into her vision of a natural disaster overtaking human settlements and giving way to a forest. Comparing trees to huge green fireworks, she imagines the innumerable trees she saw during her life, the waves of forest that cover the earth like a heartless sea, envelop her exhausted body and go up in flames. The cities, small towns, and roads are just floating above like bridges or islands big and small, gradually floating off somewhere on boiling hot waves. Boiling hot waves have overtaken human settlements, manifesting material effects of rapidly warming temperatures and sea level rise. Han uses the Korean word bulgot, which means fireworks, or more literally, fire flowers, to narrate this speculative disaster event, but she also gestures toward Gwangju's political representation in the democratic imaginary. The word appears on various plaques in Gwangju's Memorial Park, including on a small monument to the completion of the 518 National Cemetery that says, "The brilliantly burning month of May is a flower of fire." Han's fire imagery may allude to the broader 70s labor struggle, marked symbolically by the famous 1970s self-immolation of John Tae-il, a 22-year-old tailor. It may also allude to the women-led wildfire night school, active in the Gwangju region in the later 70s, and instrumental in introducing workers to labor rights and democratic unions. Han's associative links across her two novels speak to a South Korean speculative orientation toward the temporality of democratic politics, reactivate past democratic struggles in the present, while it mourns those who suffer under capitalism's historical repetitions. Han beckons us toward future precarity under capitalism by prompting us to consider the militarized state's historical atrocities in a broader natural history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adhy. So at this point now, we're going to turn to Q&A, and I see all the thumbs up and the applauses. I'm going to give my applause here. Thank you so much to all our presenters. So at this point, I'm going to open up the chat. So if folks would like to submit questions that way, then I invite you to do so. Otherwise, I ask that if you do want to ask a question, that you that you reveal yourself and you unmute your video and unmute your audio and ask in that fashion. I guess I will moderate the Q&A at this point, and if you could just raise your virtual hand, and I'll do my best to sort of keep track of the order in which those hands are raised. Yeah, thank you again to all our presenters. I think you've provided us with these very powerful and vivid accounts of the voracious capacity for transnational capitalism and fascism to devour entire menus of progressive political commitments like multiculturalism, environmentalism, human rights, labor rights. And you've given us a very powerful depiction of how women in particular are used as the conduits for this dialectic of care and the carceral. Yeah, I mean, if there, and I also invite our panelists to ask each other questions, to pick up on strands of interest that have come up in each other's presentations as well. So we'll just give a few moments for the the awkward silence to kind of spread around us so we can gather our thoughts and generate questions. All right, Rachel.
I'll take a stab. Can everyone hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you everyone for these great papers. And I'm going to wend to question. A lot of rich and interesting work. And one thing that occurred to me, I mean, the first dialogue that I saw develop was between Sherryl and Jonathan's paper and my goodness. I'll just launch into the question. So the question has to do with futurity and the way in which we think of futurity, and our ideas of our ideas of what will survive, right, in a temporal horizon that is next. And one of the things that I was thinking about in relationship to JC's paper and Sherryl and Jonathan's paper had to do with the figure of not growing up, but basically growing back, or returning to a state of something like nascent transformability. Like the pluripotent stem cell or the younger child is that which is now the symbol of the future, counterintuitively, right? So if we think about life course as, you know, I don't know, embryo to adult or aged, in fact, the reverse is being displayed to us through these novels, right? Instead, you have, for instance, in Untouchable Sea, the fetishization of the anime character, of this kind of young-ish girl, kind of that will always be a girl, always be a derpy, you know, a kind of a cute little animated figure. And then also this idea coming across in that which we fetishize and commoditize in well, actually the current moment, which is reproductive capacity. Like, you don't really care about anyone developing fully. It's not about a population surviving. It's about using and commodifying that potential. What would that idea of futurity, and that's very much about like the speculative and the economic as well. How would that, how would we put that notion in relationship to care work? And by that I mean, of course, there's that radical notion of care work that Trisha, I was starting to write down your definition of the creation and maintenance of, and then I got lost because I was scribbling down, but I think it was something like life supports or support for life collaboratively. How does that come in and intervene in that notion of sustaining and commoditizing the young, the potential capacity always, rather than the development of something that, you know, grows fully and flourishing? Sorry, Chris, I was trying to like get a question that would like tie everyone together, and that's the best I can do. So someone wants to go into that observation and you know, how we're positioning care in relationship to futurity, especially when futurity is so much being emptied out, hollowed out, and commoditized as like the ungrown. And that's for anyone.
I can leap in a little bit. I think we think about very similar things like the stem cells and those kinds of questions. And I do think that you're exactly right, that it's interesting that what's fetishized is reproductive capacity, as long as like entities are fetuses, they're very celebrated under a kind of right to life kind of politics, but once they become actual people, they take on particularities that then they become debilitated lives, rather like it's only the potentiality that can be valued in this kind of way. And I mean, I think there's also something about this regression fantasy in the anime characters that has everything to do with the sort of nostalgic orientation of fascist politics too. And so those things all seem bound up with me. And I guess like where at least I'm going, I think Jonathan and I are going, but he can correct me if he's wrong with this, is one of the reasons we're so interested in thinking about futurity in the next generation outside like the child, is to think kinship outside of the sort of reproductive couple, outside the kind of like tendency towards tribalism that can come out of thinking too strongly in terms of the family, heteronormative or homonormative, as we were trying to get at a little bit in this paper. And I think that's where it might intersect really interestingly with the care work that Trisha's thinking about, right? About communities organizing outside of these patriarchal, state-sponsored, capitalist implicated kind of forms, so that people can care for one another. Because I think something that's really fascinating about your paper, Trisha, is this sort of doubly difficult position it puts these Filipino nurses in. On the one hand, like making them complicit with this carceral system where their care work becomes coercive and confining, yet they're also in a sort of capitalist transnational labor market where their families at home also need the remittances. What are they to do but to work in the jobs made available to them? And so I think like trying to find ways to have coalition-based politics across the ways capital traps us in these complicities is maybe one way to take some of that.
I might just sort of pick up on that quickly and note that while you were talking about the kinds of regressions depicted in these futurities, I was immediately thinking about, particularly in The Handmaid's Tale, the infantilization, in particular, of women. You know, so women are in some ways controlled by pitching them back at a very dependent level, in which their whole lives are basically infantilized. And you know, not to be too overly ambitious or grandiose, but it would be interesting to think about how contemporary carceral capitalist structures position many people in this infantilized way as a way to control them. And that of necessity means that we are not thinking about the maturing individual, the individual or groups that are maturing. And in fact, I'm often, as someone getting increasingly older, surprised at how often these works, many works of speculative futurity, don't really consider the aged population in some ways. It does seem to be increasingly a blind spot, you know, as though we are just, in terms of our, not just capitalist realist fiction, but also maybe capitalist speculative fiction, just not attuned to thinking about long-term maturation. But I may be diverging and getting off on tangents. Just what I was thinking about in relation to your rich question, though.
Sherryl, you mentioned that you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I fear it might be more rambling, then I'll stop talking, but I'm gonna try to make it a question, which was for Trisha. I enjoyed all the papers, but I was really struck by your paper, probably because I teach at UC Riverside, which is very close to San Bernardino, so these things are definitely, and Dylan Rodriguez is my colleague, so I know him and his work quite well. And I noticed on one of your slides, when you were talking about the San Bernardino police and their involvement in the healthcare system, you mentioned Dignity Health, which has been a point of contention in the UC system recently about whether or not we were going to partner with Dignity Health because they have hospital beds available, and I guess our UC system lacks capacity, but they're a Catholic-based healthcare service, and so there were lots of concerns about denial of care for LGBTQI people, denial of reproductive services, so tying in with some of the things we're thinking through with Handmaid's Tale. And so I was kind of, this is where I'm having trouble turning it into a question, but I wonder if there's ways to think through some of the alternative social values and the goals of the prison abolitionist movement with something that would also try to think of healthcare outside of sort of for-profit insurance industry American model, which remains very foreign to me as someone who's not originally from America. So I wonder if there's also links to think through there in terms of, you know, I know another one of your slides talked about sort of the need to be able to refuse care as well as to have access to care. And then I also think then another piece of that Dignity Health reminded me of is the some populations or people identified as populations is probably a better way to put that, being refuse certain kinds of care or perhaps refuse care at all. And I do think this is a looming political crisis for us, depending on how the next month goes. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I didn't actually know that about Dignity Health and the UC system, although it makes a lot of sense. Dignity Health really came up in my knowledge, I guess, through this like particular instance. But it's really actually interesting because, yeah, I think, I think what's doubly or triply interesting to me is that St. Bernardino Hospital is one of the most, it's the public hospital in San Bernardino, and it serves the most uninsured patients. And so you can imagine that healthcare provided at St. Bernardino's, or now Dignity Health, is not probably really going to be coming up to par, especially if the contract that they just entered into is with the police department. And so yeah, so in addition to the types of care they could provide, I think it's also interesting that the care that is provided in this hospital is with the kind of like overpresence of police. So in that same space.
Yeah, thank you. The policing the healthcare provided and then just policing the people who get access to healthcare in other ways too. Yeah, thanks.
Great. So yeah, I invite folks to raise that virtual hand if there are any questions, or to submit questions via chat. Again, maybe if I could ask a question in the meantime to JC. So this conceit of keeping in Lee's novel seems, as you're reading the novel, a lot about the novel seems to sort of come out of left field. Keeping is one of those things. It's not really expected when you arrive at those scenes to have this this sort of cultural practice of keeping humans and modified humans as pets. But I wonder, hearing everybody talk just now about various I guess forms and institutions of incarceration and care, it just reminds me of how the care relationship and the relations that are established by incarceration are dependent upon various frameworks of infantilization as well. And so keeping actually seems like a very kind of apt metaphor for that sort of suffuses all of the things that all the presentations that we've heard today. But I wanted to ask you, JC, about the kind of toggling back and forth between particularity and generalization, especially when it comes to Asian racial form in On Such a Full Sea. So as you mentioned, there is that character. Well, the girls that are kept by Miss Kathy are referred to, in this sort of general racist term as just like Asian or like seeming Asian, if memory serves. But Mala, who is a housekeeper in Miss Kathy and Mr. Leo's household, is I think referred to more specifically as, you're saying, Southeast Asian. I think I can't quite remember if she's referred to specifically as Filipina, but I think that's sort of the implication that she is Filipina. But I was wondering what you make of Lee's contending with this kind of tension between the sort of general Asian stereotype, right, and the particularity of Mala as a character and the kind of work, the kind of reproductive labor that she does in that household. And I think, as I've mentioned in some of our conversations before, one of the literary texts that On Such a Full Sea really, and especially that these scenes with the girls and this practice of keeping, that really reminds me of, is George Saunders' short story, The Sepulchre Girl Diaries. And those who have read the story will recall that the sort of the conceit is that wealthy people keep as ornaments these Southeast Asian women's, and I think explicitly Filipino women's bodies in their yards, and they just sort of hang there on these kind of IV like supports from I think it's trees. It's been a while since I've read the story, but I mean, what's interesting to me about that is how it sort of reverses this this kind of stereotype that I think Americans especially have of Filipino nurses. So rather than the nurses being the ones administering the IVs in the Sepulchre Girl Diaries, they're the ones that are sort of, it's the bodies of the Filipinas that are sort of being supported by this kind of IV-like tether. But there's in Saunders' story, there is this emphasis on the specificity, the sort of national specificity, or the racial form of those ornamental Asian female bodies. And so I'm just wondering what you make of that kind of play of specificity and generalization in Lee's novel more generally.
Right. So like you're attending to a tension, right, between, say, the vagueness attributed to the girls that also lends to the stereotyping surrounding them versus the sort of like particularity of Mala's situation as someone who is coerced into complicity in a different form of exploitation that in its own way, right, as the girls are being housed in these secret parts of the villa, it is indeed the trappings of like carcerality, no pun intended in terms of trappings, that like they are kept and confined this way. I know that like for Ursula Le Guin, who reviewed this book On Such a Full Sea in the past, I mean, one of her prominent critiques was just how inexplicable a lot of the phenomena in the book was, right? Like, how could it be that there were these coffee machines in this dystopia, for example? And indeed, a lot of stuff just seems to come out of left field. Not just the episode concerning the girls in terms of what Fan experiences as she tries to search for her boyfriend. So in terms specifically of the girls, it's definitely not inexplicable in Lee's mind. And it may just come as a surprise because of how, I don't know, how little the character Fan actually knows until she encounters this situation. And I think what also adds to the sort of inexplicableness of this episode is the insinuation that this isn't the only example of keeping taking place in this world. Its implicit ubiquity kind of points to the larger picture of what Lee is doing with On Such a Full Sea. which is making this grand tableau of like environmental destruction, of late stage capitalism, just permeating all of these relations and tensions, even things that aren't public, even things that like aren't so overt, to a character that has like done so much traveling in the space of the entire novel. I'm kind of like admittedly rambling in search of an answer, which is to say, I'm still struggling to make something of this entire sort of picture. But I think to sort of address the girls, right, would also be to address where On Such a Full Sea kind of maps on dystopian literature, and what it's doing that not all dystopian literature of its contemporaries might be doing as well. I just, other than the story you cited, like I struggled to think of other examples of like these carceral dynamics, these infantilizations that are also racial, being so like vivid or even present in other stories like this. Like I struggle to find that in contemporary dystopian stuff like, I don't know, The Hunger Games or Fallout, that really reckons with how racial forms that in the present day are commodified, are incarcerated, are exploited, like how that is so hyperbolized in dystopia, or how it can be. And yet, I guess I just don't see enough of that, barring the stories mentioned.
So I mean, I guess one way to sort of reframe part of that question is, what is the kind of work that the trope of the Southeast Asian female care worker, what kind of that work does that do in speculative fiction today? And I think that Trisha's presentation gave us I think a really vivid and rich overview of the kinds of institutions that Americans, especially, I think especially Californians, have come to associate Filipina labor, especially. And I think maybe we could sort of broaden this the question that I'm asking to one about the geopolitical and the transnational that runs through everybody's presentation. Obviously, under the heading of our symposium. But what is the sort of geopolitical specificity, for instance, of for the Handmaid's Tale with Canada? Is it merely just this space that is a kind of geographically continuous landmass with the United States that can provide this alternate, this kind of counterpoint to the fascism of Gilead, or is there something more kind of particular to the Canada in The Handmaid's Tale? And and Adhy, you go very quickly through the Mitchell, for instance, but what I think one question would be like, why is it Korea that is the sort of techno-orientalist future in Cloud Atlas? What are the sort of affordances that of the South Korean context for Mitchell, and how might that fit into the kind of liberal human rights Cold War framework that that you're taking up in Hong Kong's work? So we just have a few minutes left, and so I just invite folks to sort of take up that very sort of like casting about set of observations as they like.
Yeah, that is like something that perpetually kind of is something I wonder about, like, why South Korea? It seems so random when you could choose so many other places. And that's like that's a problem for however we conceive of the global novel or world literature, or these like huge totalizing categories. But yeah, I do think, considering the kind of Cold War history of South Korea and this idea of an Asian country that somehow has achieved capitalist democracy. So this idea of democracy as being just unquestionably capitalist, you can really see how that plays out in South Korea as kind of, you know, a byproduct of one of the major inaugurating hot wars during the Cold War. And yeah, it's interesting that like in Mitchell's novel, he chooses South Korea rather than say China, because in a lot of ways, you could kind of just map all those things we see in South Korea, like these techno-orientalist imaginations of South Korea, onto China. But I think it's still very much like this kind of Cold War kind of imaginary that's at play, where China is somehow like on the other side of this boundary, and South Korea is on the inside of the US boundary. Like South Korea is considered like in a bilateral relationship with the US. So there are these like geopolitical ways of like boundary making that like affect how we imagine the future. But yeah.
Great. So we just have a 2 minutes left, and a question came in for Adhy. So I really liked your presentation, interested in what you think about the future of humanisms, and maybe if humanism can be saved from capitalist realism / neoliberalism.
Okay, yeah, so just in the last minute, that is a huge question, but just thinking back to like what maybe Trisha was saying about care work, like these new ways of imagining what care looks like without becoming post-humanist necessarily, right? But yeah, I think like just thinking about like this moment in the 70s and 80s with labor activism in South Korea and how they appealed to the human without necessarily knowing even what human rights was, like what the legal like logistics, or how to even like conceive of like feminism, like these yeah, liberal vernaculars. They didn't really know, a lot of these workers didn't exactly know what they were, but they still appealed to a kind of they appealed to their own humanity, you know, in a way that was not necessarily like rights focused. So I think we can look to, yeah, like leftist histories on a global scale and see what we can imagine for like future collectivities.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe part of that South Korean specificity has to do with the fact that the storyline in Cloud Atlas is that of it's a labor uprising, right? Essentially. So okay, so we have I guess this will have to be the last question, but Neil, you want to?
Yeah, thanks to all of you who presented. These were great presentations, and I am interested in thinking about the question of speculation, in part because we're talking about kind of forces of control that seem to have clamped down and shut down possibilities. And so I'm interested in how historically we're going to think about that. So Trisha, if I could just engage with your presentation a little bit more, because I know that one of the kind of erroneous narratives that we have about the expansion of the prison industrial complex in California and elsewhere is that it was deinstitutionalization. It was the removal of psychiatric institutions that in some sense led to people being corralled into prisons. And so one of the cool things about this project that you're doing is, first of all, showing that no, actually, like, that still continued. That nexus of kind of mental health lockdown and prison lockdown is still connected. But what's perhaps more interesting for the issue of the speculative is the way that for that to kind of be reproduced, there had to be the recruitment of this diasporic labor population, right? So I'm just wondering how we can kind of work with these histories that seem divergent, right? The institution, the psychiatric institution and the prison, but then see through the kind of transnational migration, the suturing together of it. And so I'm wondering, you know, how you're, you know, if you are kind of drawing from disability studies paradigms and thinking about specifically mental health as an area where there's its own disability discourse, right? So I know Liat Ben Moshe has written a little bit about the relationship between abolition of prisons and deinstitutionalization. But if any of that is informing your work and where you might see the project going, given the focus on the labor diaspora and the way that it's been crucial to reproducing this system.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot for me to think about, and I really love the recommendations. And since this is a relatively new project, I'll try to keep this short. Yeah, I think disability studies is where I'll go next. And what I see in transnational Filipino diasporic work is more like moments of like the possibility of being incarcerated or going to jail for undergoing a mental health crisis. And that seems to be just like something interesting that I noted. But also what made me think about, what else? That also reminded me too about is that, right, in the 70s or in this wave of migration to the US, obviously there was a different type of futurity in mind for the people who wanted to work in the US and live in the US. And I think it's important to know that that type of futurity wasn't mapped on into where a lot of these nurses ended up, which is in state hospitals. And so perhaps within the like gaps between this, between those two types of futurities, like there could be some type of, you know, alternate way forward of hopefully undoing and abolishing this type of, the carceral system in the US. Which I think, you know, reminds me repeatedly about all of the presentations today about, you know, really like how reproduction is also like so important, not biologically, but amongst other peoples. And the reproduction of community and also resistance efforts is so important in determining the type of futurity that we want.
Great. Well, let me thank all our presenters again. Your presentations were so wonderful, and thank you to everybody for attending. And please keep in mind that next Friday, October 16th, we'll be having our next panel, Borders, from 1 to 3 p.m. PST. So be on the lookout for advertisements and links to RSVP for that. So thanks so much, everybody. Again, the video, the recording of this panel will be on the Speculative Futures website sometime in the next few days. So thanks, everyone.